Swatching. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Can you just not figure out what all the fuss is about? This is the first in a new video series all about swatching. Welcome to the Crimson Stitchery, a video channel about making all things beautiful and useful. My name is Anushka and you can find relevant links for this video in the show notes down below here on YouTube. And just before we get started, let's make a cup of tea. Today I'm drinking the Guarana chai tea that was kindly sent to me by Bird and Blend. I've been enjoying making loose leaf tea for several years now, and it's always fun to try new types. So this one is a caffeine alternative which has a really woody herbal scent with lots of fresh spices. Thanks Bird and Blend. I'll put a link to their website in the YouTube description box. So here's my spiced chai. I'm just enjoying the fact that it's turned bright yellow, which is just a little bit of fun. And as you can see, I didn't make it in any kind of strainer, but the spices themselves have mostly fallen to the bottom of my cup, and I'm enjoying it in a clear glass mug. And a bit of extra fibre crunching the seeds too. Okay, let's get to it. This video is going to be an introduction to the fundamentals of creating knitted and crochet swatches. So I always say to crocheters, I often use the word knitting as a default, and that's just because knitting is my main craft, but I do crochet as well. And most of what I chat about is definitely going to be applicable to crochet too. I have already released a video called Yarn Substitution 101, where I did broach the topic of swatches, and we did start getting into a really great conversation about that down in the comments. So thank you to everyone who has watched and commented on that video already. And if you haven't managed to see it yet, I'll put a link to it on screen up there now. So in this video, I'm really going to take it back to basics and just cover all the fundamentals of what, where, who, how, and why of swatches. Kind of like I also did in a comparable video series called Knitting with Whole Super Soft, where I explored how to work with a yarn that is sold on the cone in bulk with spinning oil kept in. So again, there's a link on screen there now if you're curious about that. So let's start with the very, very basics. What is a swatch? What am I talking about? What are knitters and crocheters talking about when we go on about swatches? What is the big deal? Essentially, a swatch is a small sample of the finished product. And the word swatch itself can obviously be found in different situations and crafts. If you think about a paint swatch, that's generally, you know, small sample cards which have got the real paint painted on, which you're meant to take into your home, hold up to your walls and understand how, you know, the colour will react in different light situations and so on and so forth. Another place that you might get a swatch is in a fabric shop. If you are buying fabric off the bolt, you might ask for a bunch of samples or swatches where the draper will just, you know, snip a little bit off the end so that you can handle it again, so that you can take it back to your studio, you know, compare it to different things, think about the weight, the handle, the feel, and how it might work out once it's made up into a larger project. So obviously for a knitted and crochet swatch, that's exactly the same principle. It's a sample, it's a trial, but the difference with knitting and crochet is that you have to create the fabric yourself. So you actually have to dedicate a little bit of time to making that swatch. It's not as simple as, you know, slapping a bit of paint on a card or just chopping a little bit of fabric off. You have to invest a little bit more time into it, which is where I think we begin to enter into this space where many knitters and crocheters, it seems, might be slightly reluctant to do so. I'm going to get onto that later. So when you are making your swatch or your sample, what you're basically doing is a range of things, but mainly you're working up the yarn into a small piece of fabric to check that it is definitely going to be suitable for your purposes. And by suitable, I mean a range of things. It might be that you need to practice a particular stitch pattern, and it's a good idea to do that in a small sample. It might be that you're choosing a different yarn from the one recommended in the pattern, or you're just experimenting with yarn full stop, and you need to see how it's going to work up in the fabric. Obviously, your imagination is going to take you so far, and the more experienced you are, the better decisions you're going to make, but actually seeing the yarn worked up into a piece of fabric using all of the same techniques that you're going to be doing for your larger project is just such a helpful tool to have in your arsenal. I just want to highlight up front that the swatch is, again, a tool. It's a piece of information for you where you can experiment on a very low stakes kind of way, on a very small piece of fabric, not using up too much yarn. You know, you can just experiment, try things out, and test things out too. And you should be trying to recreate as many of the same techniques in the finished project in the swatch. For example, if you're knitting a project in the round, like a hat or, you know, parts of a jumper, then it's important to work the swatch in the round as well, because that is going to affect your technique and your tension. What do I mean by tension? By tension, I'm referring to the force that you, the maker, are imparting onto the thread, the yarn, when you're working it up. So the yarn is going from the ball through your hands, around the needles, then being manipulated and then being pushed off the needles, and then the whole process is repeated again. And it's not got two legs, it's not got a mind of its own, it's you controlling it. And the way that you hold the yarn through your hands, the way that you're pulling and pushing and winding is going to be very individual to you, not just you as a person, but you in every given situation that you are doing the knitting in or crochet. And it may be liable to change as well. It's really important not to assume that your own personal working tension will ever be the same as any other knitters, okay? There are so many things that affect working tension, and it's basically unique to the knitter. I think if we go back to comparing knitting and crochet with other crafts, it's quite a useful way to think about tension, because if you're using a sewing machine, before you launch into your very fine dressmaking project or quilting or whatever it is, it's generally a good idea to run off a few stitches onto a piece of scrap fabric. And there have been loads of times where I have done that initial stitch, you know, all of my stitching tension through the machine, you know, with the tension discs, seems to be aligned perfectly, and then suddenly halfway through the project something might happen, my tension might suddenly become too tight or too loose. And that's because, again, even with a machine, there are just so many factors at play when it comes to tension. It's kind of like a living active force. And when we are creating a swatch, we're basically creating a record and a measurement of our own personal tension so that we can judge how that affects the finished fabric, you know, the actual weight and the drape of the finished cloth that we're creating. And if we're working from a pattern, we need to check that our personal tension is the same as the person that wrote down the pattern. Because if it's not, for a variety of reasons, whether or not you have used the exact same yarn as the pattern specified, if your tension is not the same, you're not going to get the same results as the pattern suggested, because all of the calculations in a knitting and crochet pattern will have been done against the tension of the swatch and the sample of the pattern writer, the pattern designer. What is gauge, and is this different from tension? Okay, so the words gauge and tension and even swatch you might see and hear used in a slightly interchangeable manner. And in many ways, they are referring to more or less the same thing. You can use the words gauge and tension interchangeably when you're referring to the number of stitches in any given area. So it's kind of like when you're buying bed sheets and you're looking at the thread count, and you know that if you buy a cotton or linen bedsheet with a very high thread count, there's loads of threads crammed into the same area, so the fabric is going to be a lot finer. And it's the same idea with gauge and tension. You're measuring how many stitches fit in the area. And when you compare that to the type of yarn that you are working with, that's going to give you an indication of what the finished fabric is going to be like. So when you're creating your swatch, you then need to measure your swatch and note down how many stitches across horizontally and how many rows down vertically occupy a 10 centimetre or 4-inch area. And these numbers, the width and the length, are your gauge or your tension. These are the numbers that you're going to see on a ball band of yarn when they state what the manufacturer's recommended gauge is, or in other words, the tension that you should be working at to produce the kind of fabric that the manufacturers suggest that the yarn is best suited for. So when you hear phrases like, I knit this at a 22 stitch gauge, that generally means that there are 22 stitches per 10 centimetres or 4 inches of fabric. So We've covered the basics and we've talked in depth about what a swatch is, how it's used, and the type of information that we will glean from it. But how big should the swatch be? So I just referred to the measurements of 10 centimeters, which is approximately 4 inches, because this is currently the most standardized and most common measurement that is used in contemporary knitting and crochet patterns. However, it's really important to always check your patterns because gauge might be measured differently. For example, you might see a tension stated per 2 inches or per 1 inch, you know, for a much smaller area. This is something that I personally have seen a lot in vintage patterns. Or gauge might be measured completely differently. For example, they might tell you the width and length of an actual motif in a knitting pattern, you know, just one individual motif, because that might not fit neatly into a round number. Again, it's worth reiterating that swatches need to be created using the techniques and the stitch patterns of your desired project. So it's not really much point only knitting swatches using basic stocking stitch, for example, if the finished project is going to be in garter stitch or in rib or seed stitch or some kind of fancy lace or cable, because creating those techniques is invariably going to utilize different tensions and the way that you work the stitch pattern is going to change. So even though you might be taking different kinds of measurements from your swatches, it's really important overall that your swatches are bigger than 4 inches or 10 centimeters. I myself generally aim to create swatches that are at least 6 inches square, which works out about 15 centimeters. And some of my swatches are a lot bigger. I've got a few here. And some of them are odd sizes, but on the whole, they need to be bigger than just 4 inches. And that's for several reasons. Firstly, a 4-inch piece of fabric is just not very big, and it's really good to kind of get a handle on your fabric as much as you can, to feel it, to throw it around, to squash it, to rub it up against, you know, your cheek and know that it's suitable for you to wear. And 4 inches is just very, very small. Another important reason is that your edge stitches are often slightly tighter or slightly looser. So when you're taking the measurement to figure out your gauge, it's important not to measure right up against the edge of the swatch, but instead take your measurements from somewhere in the middle. And I also generally tend to take at least 3 sets of measurements for the width and for the length, and then I take an average. And that's because your tension invariably will alter as you're working because things change. So do aim to create swatches of at least 6 inches or 15 centimeters. And I also sometimes knit little garter stitch borders on my swatches too, especially in stocking stitch. So that will increase the size of my swatch as well. Isn't swatching a waste of time? I had a funny comment from a viewer and a patron who wrote, "Convince me." I totally empathise with this, and I really do know the feeling of just being so excited to get started on the project. You know, you've chosen your pattern, you've bought your yarn, you've picked your colour, you've picked your size, in your head you've already made the item and you're swanning round everywhere wearing your fabulous project, receiving loads of compliments and feeling amazing, and it can feel like you just want to get those stitches on the needle, cast on and knit, 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 knit away. Or crochet. So I totally get it. But nonetheless, I say no, I do not think that swatching is a waste of time, because I see swatching as a warm-up. So again, if we compare this to different types of creative practices, you know, if you are a musician, you need to play a couple of scales or arpeggios or something easy to kind of ease you into the flow. And once your hands are physically warmed up, it's really fun to just get stuck into a piece of music and enjoy it. If these kinds of creative pursuits I've been talking about, DIY sewing and music, if that's not your jam, you know, you could even compare it to just stuff like exercise. You could launch into a 5K run cold, but you're going to have so much a better experience if you just take that moment to just take a breath, do a few stretches and physically warm your body up slowly at home before you launch into the world. In my opinion, swatching is exactly this idea of stretching before you go out for a run. Just taking that extra moment to get to know your yarn a little bit better, get to know the stitches in your pattern, become more comfortable, work some cables and figure out if you can cable without a cable needle, if you need to practice that, or if it just looks better to cable the old-fashioned way. If you're trying out a completely different yarn, you might think that it's going to look fabulous in the pattern, but it might just be flat. It might just not work out. Or that could even be due to the colours that you've chosen, even if you've gone with the same brand. You might decide that a certain yarn is too bright or too dark, or that the shadows cast by a cable or lace could look better if you made a different choice. And you're going to find that out through this kind of low stakes activity of swatching. And of course, swatching is in itself very creative because the pressure's off. You haven't cast on 100 stitches. You've only cast on maybe around 35 at the very most. It's not going to take that long, and you can just try things out and make sure that you're really happy with the direction that your project might be going in. I've not even got into the kind of gauge troubleshooting, like when you measure your swatch and your gauge is completely different from the designer's stated gauge. I've not got into that in this video because I'm going to do a troubleshooting and FAQ kind of video separately. So please do put your questions if you have any, or if you need me to be your knitty agony aunt, please do pop that in the comments of this video here on YouTube. Isn't swatching though a waste of yarn? Well, that depends how much yarn you've bought for your project. And if you're really, really concerned, you can always unravel the swatch and add it back to your ball. If you're working a project in the round, I tend to swatch in the round, but I leave a tail hanging behind, which I've got here. And I will be doing a separate video for swatching in the round, again, coming up soon. As you can see here, I have kept many of my swatches, though not all. I have unravelled many in the past as well to use up the fabric, especially when it comes to scrap projects like this blanket that's sitting behind me and this crochet here. Sometimes you just need a particular yarn, and that could be there for you in the swatch. Also, sometimes if you have a very, very beloved item and it needs a little bit of mending and repair work and you can't find the ball anymore, maybe you've still got the swatch so you can unravel it for those purposes. Since I've launched this YouTube channel over the last couple of years as well, I've been doing more teaching and I've been doing more designing, and so I found my swatches, my collection of swatches, to become a really useful resource for me. Again, I can experiment. I could cut them up if I wanted to. I could embroider on them, or I could even, if I wanted to, just sew them together or crochet them together and turn them into a cushion or a blanket or some other kind of tapestry or project. They are a record for me, and they are, instances of ideas that I thought might have worked but actually didn't work out, but maybe it could be good for another situation. And they are also examples of how different types of yarn look, again, in this kind of accessible manner, almost like an archive. I think especially if you ever make things to give away, it can be really nice to have this little record in your collection so that you can still take on all the lessons that you've learned from that project and have a little reminder of that and a physical example of the item too and its fabric. When can you get away with not swatching? The short answer is sure. If you're not worried about size and fit, and if you're comfortable with risk, then do what you want. I'm not the knitting police. It's your project, it's your life, it's up to you. But you've got to be really comfortable with the possibility of having to rip out your project, to unravel it and redo it. And you've got to be okay with the idea that it just might not work out, and you might have avoided a little bit of heartache if you had just swatched and taken a few measurements. Something else to consider though is if you are using yarn and needles that you have already used loads of times before and you just know how the yarn's going to work and you just know the typical tension that you get from using those needles. And again, that's down to experience. For example, when it comes to knitting socks, I often use the same kind of yarns, if not exactly the same brand, and the same needles. So I myself might not always do a stocking stitch swatch for a sock. However, I do tend to try out any stitch patterns like cables or lace beforehand still. So What it boils down to is that the more knitting that you do, the more different types of projects that you try out, and the more different yarns that you use, the more you will learn, because it all just boils down to experience. In my opinion, it's worth spending a couple of hours testing something out on a swatch before leaping into a project. But if you're comfortable taking that risk, if you're a gambler, or if you just know your materials and your tools really well at this point, then it might still work out for you just fine. So I think that I've covered the fundamentals of swatching, but if you have any extra questions, or if you'd like me to try and tackle one of your problems in my SOS swatching video, which will come up in a few weeks' time, then please do drop me a comment down below on this YouTube video. This video comes to you courtesy of all of my lovely patrons over on Patreon. Thanks so much for making this happen. Patreon is a subscription service that allows you to support the Crimson Stitchery in exchange for exclusive bonus content like extra videos, early access to patterns, and all sorts of things. So head over to patreon.com/The Crimson Stitchery to choose the right tier for you. The next couple of videos to look out for in the swatching series are a demonstration of how to knit a swatch and measure your gauge, both flat and in the round. So there'll be 2 separate videos. If you're enjoying my videos, please do hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the Crimson Stitchery so that you don't miss out on any future missives. Thanks so much for watching. Happy knitting, happy crochet, and happy swatching. Bye bye.